It's freezing here. Okay, this is the start of season 3. This is going to be a busy episode. Got a lot going on. First of all, we've got to get back to our boat, which is in southern Mexico on the border of Guatemala. Once we get there, we got a bunch of work to do before it goes back in the water and we can head to sea. But more importantly, we just got to figure out where we're going. We haven't really figured that out yet. We'll get into that later. But right now, first things first, I got to go visit a couple of friends and then we're out of here. It's too cold. We can't stay here. We got to go back to the heat. After nearly 7 months away from our little floating home, it was time. So we said goodbye to our family and friends. We pet the dog one last time. We took off our puffy coats and said adios to the sub-freezing temperatures of eastern Washington. We were going home. For us to get back home, it would take a series of rental cars, 3 different flights, a few terrible airport meals, and a couple of scary taxi rides, all totaling nearly 24 hours. But once we got back home, it felt pretty great to be there. The moment of truth. And you know what? After sitting in the tropics, closed up for nearly 7 months, it wasn't smelling so great in there. So the first priority was just clearing a path so we could open up the windows, crank up the fans, and clear out some of that funky smell. Okay, we've got good news and bad news. Good news, we're back in Mexico. That was pretty great. Pretty excited about that. But the bad news, the boat didn't really fare too well while we're gone. Didn't fare well at all, really. Came back to some pretty funky smells, mildew, corrosion, and bugs everywhere. Little tiny bugs everywhere. One thing we don't like, it's bugs, especially on our boat. Brenda's freaking out about it. She likes bugs less than I like them. So the big problem we've got really is that at some point during the last 6 or 7 months while we were gone, one of our big windows sprung a leak. Just been baking in the sun for the last 6-7 months. The seals completely popped off, so there's been a pretty big gap. And as you might guess, big old leak in the tropics during the heart of rainy season, that's not a good thing. Our boat didn't like it, and we like it even less now. Basically, everything on the port side of the boat, it's wet. Our cushions, our cabinetry, our doors and drawers and floorboards, they're all swollen so they don't open. Our fridge and our stovetop, they got filled with water, so there's a bunch of corrosion, nothing works. And all of our long-term dry storage, our pantry, it's full of water and bugs. So we've got a bunch of work to do. We actually knew we'd have a bunch of work when we got back. That's just what happens when you leave your boat for 6 or 7 months. But now we got more. Our to-do list is getting longer by the minute. But because our list has gotten quite a bit longer, we're going to have the yard take care of the bottom work. It's just some sanding, painting, some patches on the keel, pretty basic stuff. But that'll save us a few days of work in the heat, in the yard, and we can get back to living aboard quicker. So, the focus for right now is to kill a bunch of bugs and get this boat back in the water as quick as possible so we can live aboard. Then once we're back in the water, we'll take care of all the rest of the stuff. But that also means that we're going to be stuck here for quite a bit longer than we'd originally hoped. But that's alright, because we really have no place to be, and at this point, we haven't even figured out where we're going yet. Talk about that later. We got to figure that out.
Focus is for you to stop talking and start cleaning.
Getting to work. While I was working on getting us a little bit of shade, Brenda, she was busy vacuuming up little tiny bugs. The other thing is we just came from 10 degrees. It's like 95 here. That's an 85 degrees swing. Holy crap, it's hot.
Bugs are really sticky.
Once we got to a point where we could move freely without squishing any little bugs, it was time to do some of the work we'd actually planned on doing. Maybe. Oh, it's stuck.
Well, trying to open the...
There it goes. When we came back, there were a couple of projects we knew we'd have to do before the boat could go back in the water. One of them was paint the bottom, which luckily for us the yard's doing, and they're doing a great job, and it's surprisingly cheap. But the other one was the shaft seal. We've got one of these. It's a PSS dripless shaft seal that at the end of last season became a slightly dripping shaft seal, which is no good. We put this original one in 8-9 years ago, something like that, and you're supposed to actually do a rebuild on them about every 5 years, so we're a little behind the times. So now it's time to do it. It's not that difficult of a job other than access. The shaft seal on most boats is a little tough to get to, so access for us isn't too bad. I can actually sit on top of the engine and reach the shaft coupler, which attaches to the transmission. The back part of the shaft seal I actually have to crawl underneath the floorboards to get to, which isn't all that fun really. I'm a little wider than I should be to fit in there. That's the way it goes. Directions, don't need them. It's a pretty simple process. It's really just a remove and replace. There's a couple of O-rings that go in the stainless rotor, which I'll show you, but other than that, it's taking it off, putting the new stuff on. So we start by removing the bolts from the propeller shaft coupler and transmission, and then the set screws from the stainless steel rotor on the shaft seal, so we can slide the propeller shaft out of the way for access. So I've got the shaft pulled out a little bit so I have a little room for access, but what I don't have is an actual puller for the shaft coupler, but I do have a big mallet. With that out of the way, it's pretty much just taking off hose clamps and sliding everything out of the way. Pretty simple. So while I'm doing this shaft seal project, I think we should talk about our plans. This is probably the most common question I'm getting asked right now, and it's actually one of the most common topics Brenda and I are talking about, because we haven't figured it out. We realistically have a week or two, probably 2 weeks worth of work on the boat before we can go somewhere, so we have a couple weeks before we really decide. But there's a few things we're thinking about. Towards the end of last season, we were heading south, heading for Central America, and that's still probably, I think, maybe the top thing on our list, is to spend the next year roaming around Central America, maybe use Panama as a home base, and land travel through South America for a little bit. That's one option. When we originally left Seattle a handful of years ago, I wanted to get to the South Pacific. That was just my big goal. That was the dream for me. But what you may not know is that about 4 years ago, before I started putting these videos together, we actually did a season in the Pacific with some friends on their boat. And on that trip, we kind of had some pretty big milestones as far as sailors. We spent a ton of time at sea, we crossed the equator, we visited some of the most remote islands on the face of the earth. And because we already had that season out there, what it did was reinforce the fact that I want to get back out there and see more of it. So I guess that's the option number 2, is the Pacific. Option number 3, which is carrying some weight, is actually getting down to Panama, going through the canal and seeing the Caribbean for a season or two, then coming back through the canal and going out the Pacific. Lots of options. All right, so after all of that rambling, I guess the point I need to make is that we still don't have a short-term plan. We really want to see everything, so we're going to do our best to do it. But the other point, I guess, is that we have no place we have to be in any time frame. So even if it takes us 5 years to get out the Pacific, that'll be fine. Or if we do it next year, who cares? It'll happen. But more importantly, we got to finish this up. The stainless steel rotor has 2 little O-rings, which are supposed to keep water out of your boat. But for us, they were the source of our little leak. But they come out pretty easy. You clean up the rotor as best you can, put in the new O-rings, and then start putting it all back together. Now for the fun part, we gotta go under the floor. And next up is just sliding on the new bellows and tightening up the hose clamps on the stern tube. And after that, it's the carbon face, making sure to align the hose port vertical, attaching the hose, and a bunch more hose clamps. Since the stainless rotor and the O-rings are a pretty tight fit to keep water out of your boat, a mix of water and soap, it goes a long way to help this thing slide on. And the big key here, it's to not nick the O-rings as it's going back together. Otherwise, you'll be doing this all over again. So the last part of this is actually just compressing the bellows. The stainless steel rotor right now is just touching the carbon face. The bellows is in a relaxed position, so I'm going to put a mark around the shaft where that relaxed position is. For different size propeller shafts, you have to compress a different amount. We have an 1 1/4 inch propeller shaft, so we're going to compress roughly 3/4 of an inch of the bellows. So we're just compressing the bellows, squishing it in. Then we'll slide that stainless steel rotor up against the bellows and tighten down the set screws with a little bit of Loctite in there. Don't forget the Loctite. So we'll put a little Loctite in there, tighten it down, and that'll hold everything in place. So the last thing I'm going to do is put a stainless steel hose clamp on the propeller shaft, touching the stainless rotor. And that's just strictly sort of a backup precaution type of thing. If for some reason those set screws don't hold and that bellows decompresses, that's what lets a lot of water in. So to prevent that from happening, we're just going to put on that stainless hose clamp, tighten it up, cinch it down, and that's it. We're done. Off to something else. After a few quick but hard-fought days in the yard and some freshly applied bottom paint, which everybody knows is the fastest color around, it was time. Our little home would soon be floating again, and then we'd really have some work to do. And because we are floating again, well, of course, that calls for a celebration. And if you're wondering what a celebration around here entails, well, that probably goes without saying. But that's about it for this episode. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.